All right, we're live. Good to see everybody, at least in replay or whatnot. All right, so let's get into this. I am going to be reacting to Christian Wagner's conversion from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism. Let me add the screen, add the video here. What I'm going to be looking for. Um, oh, I don't think there's an echo. Anyway, all right. So what I'm going to be looking for ahead of time, haven't seen it before, is just kind of a few things. I'm going to be looking for um, if he says anything about the gospel, about justification. See, he looks rather young, which I'm not holding against him, but oh, well, that would be why I dropped from one viewer in my count. All right, that's good. Um, all right, so looking for the gospel, looking for Roman Catholic arguments that we've heard over and over again, uh, based on maybe previous things I've seen online. I'm trying to see if he's reacting to any liberalism in Anglicanism without any self awareness of what actually is the current state of modern Rome. Any, well, we have it on the screen here where you can see the thumbnail Swan made has Newman. So I want any understanding of Newman of of what problems Newman, the doctrine of development, raises, sort of that sort of thing. So let me um, make this screen bigger if I can. Can I? I guess not. Oh, let's just play. It doesn't really matter the size of the screen, I guess. All right. I might skip.
Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Christian Wagner. Christian, obviously the first time that you've been on the show, but your story is just so fascinating. You were an Anglican originally, and now you are considering and, well, actively pursuing, right, becoming a Roman Catholic. And so I want to ask you, Christian, just to introduce yourself, because I know that before this, you were a writer, you were very public. I mean, in fact, I think James White reacted to you becoming Catholic, right? So to just kind of show us your background. Tell us what it was like getting up to this point.
Yeah, so before I converted, I had a blog called Apologia Anglicana. I started it after I got married, so that must have been a year and a half ago. And at first, I just published some of my papers that I was writing for classes on there. And then eventually I started to get more serious and started to gain a few hundred followers. And then it started to get a bit bigger. And occasionally I would get people who would recognize my blog and stuff. And I expanded it to YouTube. And I was going to start actually a publisher publishing some older Tractarian dogmatic theology works. And
that would be a good idea.
I was also brought on as a contributor for the North American Anglican. So I was doing a few different things at once. I was writing contributor pieces and doing things like that. And a month ago, I converted, which was a really, so I don't know if you want to go all the way back into where all this started or not. Yeah. Do you want to do that right now?
Well, we could do kind of like an origin story, right, for Christian Wagner. So like just, maybe talk a little bit about so I'm guessing you were raised Anglican, right? Or
no,
really?
I wasn't.
Okay. So tell me about that. Yeah.
This actually, some of your story resonated with me because if I'm remembering correctly, your grandfather was in Baptist ministry, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my grandfather is an IFB pastor, kind of retired, but you know how that is. He's kind of on and off, occasionally preaching. And that's the church that I grew up in. And then in middle school, my family left due to some circumstances, and we became charismatics in the Church of God. And late high school, I was more of a nominal Christian throughout my high school years. For the sake of my mother, I won't talk about what I was doing, but about senior year of high school is when I went through my first conversion to being a more serious Christian, due to the prayers of my current wife, bless her heart. But that's what happened, and then I started almost instant.
I'm always curious. In a lot of these conversion stories, the wife follows. So I wonder if any of these conversion stories where the wife doesn't follow to if they become Catholic or even vice versa or so. But it almost always seems like the wife follows.
Listening to R.C. Sproul, listening to James White, listening to a lot of different Reformed authors. And I decided March of my senior year, it was only 2 months before I was about to graduate, that I wanted to go into ministry. And I enrolled at Reformation Bible College in Sanford. So I moved and I majored in biblical and theological studies. So I moved down to Sanford when I just turned 18, and I moved down to Sanford to start my studies. And almost instantly, within the first month or two, I met a fellow who was an Anglican, and talking with him and starting to get into the idea of a Reformed Catholicism, is that's how they phrased it, and then getting into some what are called Reformed scholastic authors and Reformed orthodoxy. So going back from these pop authors and the kind of surface level authors, who in many areas are completely contradictory to a lot of the earlier Reformed authors, who drew from Thomas Aquinas and drew from a lot of the medieval scholastics and
Many of my friends who know Aquinas well are wary of Aquinas, but so I'm gonna keep this in mind.
fathers, and I started to get into them a lot, and that was my thing. And then when COVID started, so this was I want to say March of 2020, I started to, alongside with the authors I was reading for class, I ran into these guys called the Oxford movement theologians, the Tractarians, the most famous of which is St. John Henry Newman. I have his portrait on my desk, is very influential. And I began to...
All right, so another thing I'm going to look in for, I just finished reading From Bossuet to Newman from Cambridge University Press, written sometime in the 50s. So I really want to see if there's any awareness on Christian Wagner's part that the break in claims that Newman had from the previous century. So if you went from, like, I'll just use Bossuet since he was in the title of the book. So if you go from Bossuet, where they had no conception of development of doctrine, and that just all these doctrines were handed to the apostles, and you go to Newman, where by the time of Newman, all the historical analysis kind of shows that was completely untenable. So the Newman's doctrine, was it Cardinal Manning who was very much against that? So I want to see if there's any sort of cognition on his part about that.
Realize that the hermeneutic that I was doing theology with, as somebody in the Reformed world influenced by what's called the Muller stream of Reformed thought, where you must be a Catholic, you must agree with the consensus of the fathers, and something much more robust than a popular Protestantism. I realized that I wasn't.
What is the consensus of the fathers? It's this amorphous thing. Anyway, I'm always wary when I hear someone talk about the consensus of the fathers, and then you say, "Oh, well, they didn't believe in the Assumption of Mary," and it's like, well, that's not what we mean. What you really mean is all ecclesia.
As sure that the fathers were teaching what a lot of these Reformed authors were reading, getting into reading longer treatises by the fathers, and then reading how the Tractarians began to read them. So that caused some cognitive dissonance, and I was able to.
Did you not hold a sola scriptura? Why would this cause cognitive dissonance?
Remain within the Anglican Church because I had in December of the year before became an Anglican and joined an Anglican church and was planning to start working there. And I started my current job a few months after March. So that began to happen. I began to deepen and start reading Newman, read E.B. Pusey, John Keble, started to Francis J. Hall, and a lot of these very high Anglo-Catholic authors. They're called sometimes Anglo-Papalists. Deridingly, they're called that because they look so much like the papists. And getting into that was really interesting because I began to run into a lot of ideas which smelled of Romanism, as they would say, and they began to start to make sense. So like even then there's this because when I talk about the conversion process, and I'm sure you felt this as well coming from a Protestant background, is it comes in stages, and it's almost like a marching towards a telos, where your faith is becoming, you're deepening in your faith and it's becoming more completed. You're not abandoning your former tradition, but you're beginning to grow within the Christian faith, which
I don't see how you go from sola fide to a system which perverts grace by adding works for justification before God and think that completes that in growing your faith. No, you've made shipwreck of your faith. That's just from where I say, and we were on the same side of that. I could not see going from my reformed position currently to that, and I could not see that in the same way. I just couldn't.
reaches to the telos.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So through March to about I think it was November of last year, that's when I got really deep into them, while continuing alongside them to read the Reformed Orthodox and get into some of these earlier Anglican divines, which had higher views of the episcopacy and of baptism and of the universality of the atonement and certain things like that, kind of eschewing a like popular Reformed, like John Piper, John MacArthur sort of way of thinking, and beginning to find something more robust and beginning to find something more patristic, and even dabbling in the medieval authors. That's something that a few of these early Reformed guys were doing, and which was exploded in the Tractarian movement. A lot of the English reprints were done by them in the 19th century. So in November, that's when me and this is kind of where I put the start of it, like in my mind. Me and three other friends, you know all three of them. I don't think they want their names out there just yet, but eventually I'm sure they'll be on the show for interviews.
Yeah. Although it's kind of funny though, because it seems as if Reformation Bible College is just cranking out converts,
It's just amazing, like looking around the Reformed world, especially in the Muller stream of things, guys like me who are reading the Reformed scholastics. So this isn't like surface level stuff you'll get where it's just like James White. This is reading the best of the best that they have to offer, and it's just all over the country. I've heard, like Dr. Hahn was talking about how he just has seen convert after convert, in the last year or two from these circles that we come from. But yeah, Reformation Bible College is doing really, really good for the Catholic Church. I'd like to, they actually had to have a chapel message condemning certain Romanist converts as apostates from the faith using the text from Galatians, which it was kind of obvious the group they were referring to, they couldn't directly refer to us, because that was still a sore subject, because that'll be the next step that I get to. But we sat down, and one of them and another one of them and I were hanging out, smoking cigars on the porch, and I turned to one of them, and I'd been having these thoughts about Tractarianism for a while now, and I just decide to, in my polemical state of mind, I decide to just go on about prayers, the intercession of the saints. And another one is like, wait a second. And he walks in to grab something and comes back out with a rosary. He'd been having the same sort of thoughts for 2 years at that point. And it was kind of weird. We all came together, and we had these similar thoughts about the Catholic faith that had been brewing in our minds. This was an entire year ago. So that kind of kickstarted my thought process and their thought process of more seriously considering that maybe the Roman Church might be the true church. Maybe I would have to abandon Anglicanism. And that started pretty much an internal struggle in each one of us. And I can only speak to my experience, but it was a very difficult intellectual struggle. I think the next month I picked up, I don't have it anymore, I bought new volumes, but Bellarmine's Controversies, and started reading St. Bellarmine, because he, in our church history class, he was known as the Jesuit who would strike fear into the hearts of the Reformed, and got over 100, I think it was 140 responses from the Reformed and Lutherans. And I started reading him, and I started more seriously reading St. John Henry Newman. And it was just an ebbing and a flowing over the next 11 months. 11 and a half months. I began to talk to my wife about this, and it was almost instant for her, where she was like, oh yeah, Catholicism's true. There's like the sensus fidelium with her. She's like, you know what, this is the faith that has been handed down to us. This is the faith which the Holy Spirit has infused in our souls. This is the truth.
Wait,
and
so your wife was open to Roman Catholicism? Is that what you're saying?
My wife is the daughter of 2 Pentecostal pastors.
Yeah, okay.
and yeah, right when I remember it very distinctly. This is when for Thanksgiving break, I was driving home for Thanksgiving break, and on that 13-hour car ride from Florida to Maryland, this whole time I just laid it on her, everything I'd been thinking about for the last few months, and that I've come to realize over the last few weeks. And she was basically like, I want to convert, like right now.
Oh my gosh. So that's so unusual for converts, because usually, like, if you're married, or you have, a wife, or, you have a girlfriend, or even, something like that, usually the significant other is just like, no, I don't want to do this. And then, but it's the other way around for you. And so, I mean, that's a unique blessing, I'd say, in your journey.
Oh yeah, she's been sending up plenty of rosaries over the last year for my conversion. It's been,
wow.
She just, probably couldn't have converted if it wasn't for her constant exhortations to just swim the Tiber and just let Anglicanism go, because she's not a theologian by any stretch of the imagination, but she is a faithful laywoman.
Mm-hmm.
And just knowing the faith through that mystical charism that's infused into the heart of the believer through grace. It's like the story of Saint Cyril of Alexandria, how during the Nestorian controversy, he wrote a letter to one of the oldest illiterate monks in the country. So this guy couldn't even read. And he sent a letter showing his view, and then the story is his view, and asked the guy, which one of these is true? And the monk's like, well, the faith that I've received and the faith that I live is the Cyrillian view. And this guy couldn't even read. He probably had really no idea what was going on, but he's like, this is the faith that I've received.
Mm.
And I think oftentimes we can denigrate that in believers, but there really is that true charism when we get past a lot of the rationalizing that we have and a lot of the objections that I had, and just get at what is the faith that we've received and the faith that we live in our day-to-day lives. And she understood that the faith that she lived was the Catholic faith, and that she was in imperfect communion with the Catholic Church, and she needed to that all of us needed to join the Catholic Church.
Wow,
that
beautiful.
was that I know. So that was so where am I? About December of last year. So over the next few months, I was just reading, researching. We started a group chat, all four of us. I think you're in the group chat now, actually. You're in the second iteration. Yes, Saint Aquinas Jihad is the name of the group chat. But we just kept throwing patristic quotes at each other and kept arguing back and forth. And during this time, I'd actually done, because I'd been struggling with these issues, I'd done some anti-Roman Catholic polemics. I wrote an article for the North American Anglican against the Thomistic view of transubstantiation and the question of the separability of the accidents. It wasn't phrased like that because it's for a popular audience, but that's what I was getting at. Some of the late medieval disagreements with St. Thomas in his metaphysics on the point of the accidents in transubstantiation existed without a subject. So I'd been engaging in that during this time, and I'd thought about 2 or 3 months ago. I think I texted a friend and I said, I think my Roman fever is gone. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was sitting at the desk I'm sitting at now, and I don't have the book on me right now, but I had, my Latin professor had mentioned that there's a newly translated work by St. John Henry Newman that he actually wrote in Latin, and it's called On the Evolution of Catholic Dogma, different than the Development of Christian Doctrine, which I'd read 3 or 4 times at this point because I just loved it. I was eating it up. But that Sunday afternoon, I decided to finally pick it up because I'd bought it and it was sitting on my shelf, and it looked like an interesting work, and it was short, so I figured I could read it in an afternoon. And this was his scholastic presentation of his theory of doctrinal development. And I picked it up and I maybe got 3 pages in, because when St. Newman started to talk about the way in which the apostolic deposit is received by the church, and the way in which it's determined by the church, and the way in which Scripture interacts with the church through history and its magisterial decisions, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I realized that I wasn't a part of the true church, and that the only option I had at that moment was either to fall under the condemnation of Lumen Gentium, that no man knowing the truth of Roman Catholicism can be saved if he denies it, or I could convert at that point, because I knew that through the I'd written 60, 70 articles at that point, and through all the thought that I've laid out, and through the theology that I'd written, I knew that I had just given myself enough rope to hang my Anglicanism, so to say, because especially on the rule of faith, that is what really got me, is the rule of faith.
Yeah, could you describe that a bit more, the rule of faith?
Yeah, so you can I think the North American Anglican still has it. If you go on my link tree, there's a link to my contributor page. They still have the article up, but the article I wrote was called The Catholic Anglican Rule of Faith. and it was presenting a Tractarian rule of faith, where because rule of faith in some is what is the standard by which we know the faith, and Protestants, their conception of the rule of faith is scripture alone. That's the famous statement, but it's a little more complicated than that, but I'll just leave it there. But for the Tractarians, the rule of faith very much was magisterial in a sense, that the seven Catholic councils, as they would put it, because after the schism they wouldn't believe that there was any ecumenical councils, that the seven councils was the authentic interpretation of scripture to be received. And the issue with that is the binding document for Anglicans, the 39 Articles, teaches against the veneration of images.
Right.
Yeah. So how do you reconcile the 39 Articles and the seven councils? So St. John Henry Newman, he had a certain way of going about it, where he would, in Tract 90, he would have a certain hermeneutic of continuity when he was still an Anglican, where he would read the 39 Articles in very creative ways to get around that condemnation, which is very clear condemnation. But the solution that I had presented is that we're part of a duplex ecclesia, that we're part of the local Anglican church, we're also part of the Universal Catholic Church, and that the upper grades of authority have more authority than lower grades of authority. So if the Universal Church says something and the Anglican Church says something else, and they're in conflict, then we go with the bigger dog. We go with the Universal Church, because they have greater authority, they have greater magisterial authority, to put it in a Catholic way. But the issue with that is that the Western Latin councils still exist. So as a member of the English Church, I'm also part of the Western Catholic Church. And who's the patriarch of the Western Catholic Church? The Roman Pontiff. and who was at every single Western ecumenical council up to that point? The English Church. So in order for me to consistently have this hermeneutic, which made sense in my mind and could be reconciled in a certain way to the Catholic view, there's that idea of layered authority when it comes to local councils. If I were to hold that view, I would have to agree with all of the councils from before Trent and after Nicaea too. And I couldn't be an Anglican because they affirmed many papal doctrines. You get, for example, in the Fourth Lateran Council, the definition of transubstantiation, and you get at the Council of Constance the definition of papal supremacy, and you get at a lot of these medieval councils, you get things that I couldn't hold to as an Anglican. So at that point, I was basically stuck. I had really stuck myself, and this was a very laborious after.
I know I haven't been saying much, but wouldn't Sola Scriptura just be so much easier than this hermeneutic?
Because I'd been reading it and I'd been pacing back and forth. I'd just been wrestling over it. I'd been scribbling and writing and I'd been texting Ethan. I think I even texted you that night. I think I even sent a message to you, trying to figure out how I could get out of this. Then finally, I'd forgotten to eat dinner, and I just was so into this. And finally, I just realized that I couldn't get out of it. And during this process, there was just an intense love for the church infused into me, where I had just come not only to know the church as the true church that Christ had established, but I'd also come to love that church, where not only did I know I had to come into union with her, but I just wanted to, above all things, is I wanted Christ, and I wanted his bride, and I wanted the Eucharist, and I wanted all these things with an intense love. And that most people don't have that short window of time, but that afternoon.
This is a good place to pause. This is a very excellent comment. Concept that an authority could be wrong, that you don't just blindly follow an authority. This is why I said sola scriptura is just easier. I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier in the beginning in my preface, but yeah, what about Pope Francis? Are we ever going to mention his name? No, let's keep going.
And I just logged off. I prayed a rosary and went to bed, and I knew that I had to become a Catholic. And I woke up the next morning and I still wanted to be a Catholic. So it worked.
Wow, that's wonderful. Yeah, I remember when you messaged me that night and you said something like my Anglicanism is on its deathbed, right? So you were saying like you were so close to becoming Catholic. And I just want to reflect on something that you said, which is you talked about how you had this kind of a recognition, right, that you're not in the church that Christ had originally established, the church that he intended for his flock to always remain in. And
Yeah.
I had an experience like that in my own conversion. I was in a bookstore with my friend Andy, and I realized all of a sudden, it just hit me, after a long time of just studying and praying and meditating on the word and also on, the history of the church, that I wasn't home. And that
Yeah.
feeling of just like, man, I've lived the first 19 years of my life homeless, basically. That just kind of
Yeah.
hit, in a very powerful, potent way. And so I appreciate you sharing that, and especially the desire to have the fullness of.
This homeless bit is, I don't think any of this is something like the modern Roman Catholic magisterium would say. And it's something Catholic apologists say, but it's not really something that you would hear coming out of the mouth of Pope Francis.
Christ. That's beautiful. But now I noticed that in the conversations that we had, especially when you got the condemnation from James White, it had something to do with I think it was Perpetual Virginity of Mary.
Yes. I had recorded a video months ago defending the perpetual virginity of Our Lady. And it kind of it didn't blow up at first.
Yeah.
Then a certain Presbyterian.
I didn't see that, but one would wonder how you would defend that based on church fathers disagreeing with the concept.
Friend of mine, he eventually watched the video, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'm convinced of the perpetual virginity of Mary," which isn't a crazy thing to be clear. It isn't a crazy thing for the Reformed, because most of the Reformed up until the middle of the 17th century would have affirmed the perpetual virginity of Mary, and even after that. But he said, "I'm beginning to affirm the perpetual virginity of Our Lady," and he tweeted that, and it blew up that they saw somebody who was Reformed and part of the Reformed Catholic movement. And James White eventually got on his feed, and he responded with his typical "it's Gnostic" garbage, absolutely garbage. And
all right, this Roman fever is a desire for an idealized Rome, eternal Rome. There's a reason that the current pontiff is never part of these conversation stories. Yeah. Go look up my video, The Psychology of Catholic Converts. It goes over the idealized part. The messy reality is often hidden. Maybe after a few years after it's settled in, I always wonder if they have buyer's remorse, even if they stick with it. But okay.
James White watched my video because somebody sent my video to him saying, "Hey, this is what got him." And I look back on it and I regret it, but like for a 10-second portion of the video, I was talking about the Proto-Evangelium of James,
Right.
and I just dismissed this argument from James White. I say basically it's a stupid argument anyways.
Man.
And he listens to the video, and then he hears his own name, so he feels the need to defend himself. And on two dividing lines in a row, he mentions the both of us, and he says, nasty things about me. And then he does a whole like 50-minute response to me and says a whole bunch of nasty stuff about me. And I was very kind. I said I've been a fan of you for a very long time, because like I said, I've been listening to him since I was in high school.
Yeah.
I listened to all of his great debates with like Robert Sagentis and
Kabir Ali too, right? Like,
yeah,
all the great debates.
I listened to all of the Catholic Protestant debates that he produced, and I was just sucking them up, and I loved it. I listened to Dividing Line every time it came out. Even in my Tractarian days, I would still do that. Although recently I've had a lot more work to do, and so I can't waste my time listening to James White and hear about his crazy COVID conspiracy theories that he brings forth every week. That's not what I'm interested really in. I have no business talking about that. But yeah, and he just went after me, and I never publicly posted any of this. I think I sent the manuscript to you, but I had spent a few days preparing a response to him, a very orderly, scholastic type response, the type of stuff I like to do. And I typed it all up. I basically had it all done, and I just never responded to him. I still have it saved. Maybe eventually I'll do a video about it, but I'm taking a little bit of a break after my conversion. So
yeah,
eventually it might get airtime, but not yet.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite stressful, going through the conversion process and then feeling like you have to constantly defend yourself. And then every time you defend yourself, it's like nobody really listens or hears what you have to say. I mean, so
Yeah.
when you got this response from James White, and you listen to the response, leaving aside kind of, the polemical side of things, did you find any arguments that were interesting, or, what did you think about his response?
It wasn't good. That's my. I mean, I've been listening to him for years, so I've heard everything he's already said about it 10 times.
Right.
So nothing was particularly interesting, and nothing was particularly good. It's just same thing heretics have been saying for centuries.
Yeah. So what was
anything good on your side? Anyway.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but what are your arguments then for the perpetual virginity of Mary? If you just could do a brief kind of overview, and then we can direct them to the longer video.
Oh yeah, for the perpetual virginity of Mary, so first you get the exegetical arguments. So looking at, for example, the most famous is during the angelic visitation, when Our Lady said, "How can this be, knowing that I do not know a man?" And the deduction that can be made from that is that she was never intending on knowing a man, which, i.e., perpetual virginity. And then there's also
that's extremely weak.
So the typological arguments which could be made from, for example, from Ezekiel, which is the gate in which the Lord passes through, in which no man will ever pass through again, talking about Our Lady. Which
also weak. Steve Christie and I go over this.
was actually picked up on by, interestingly enough, Thomas Cranmer, which was the author of the Book of Common Prayer and got burned at the stake by Queen Mary. He was one of the Protestant reformers, because a lot of the Protestant reformers, all of them actually, affirm this doctrine. And then you have the historical arguments. This is where the rubber met the road between Dr. White and I, because so there's two theories on the origin of the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. The first theory, which is Dr. White's, which makes no sense, honestly, is that it comes from something called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which was a 2nd century text from somebody. It could have been Gnostics. It could have not been Gnostics. There's nothing particularly in the text which would force one to interpret it as a Gnostic text. And that the second interpretation is obviously that it came from the apostles. So
could couldn't there be a third that it grew over time? I'm still not hearing anything about the gospel, but okay.
The issue with Dr. White's interpretation has to do with the fact that first, if it was a Gnostic heresy,
I think their argument is that Mary was never planning on consummating her marriage. Something? I don't know. Guys, I'm going to take a quick 30-second pause.
why don't you see it in any of the anti-Gnostic writers? Because you look at Against Heresies by St. Irenaeus, I remember reading that, and he lists every single jot and tittle that the Gnostics believed against the Catholic faith. It's 5 sizable books. It's a whole, I don't have it anymore, but it takes up a whole volume in the Shaft set, which is just a lot of text, and he's writing about every single Gnostic heresy known to man. So how could he have just missed this distinctively Gnostic doctrine? And then second, you have the spread of the doctrine doesn't make sense from a second century source, because especially a second century source which wasn't that popular, because you have a very widespread doctrine in the 3rd century is when you get people start to pick up on it. In ancient times, you don't get documents spreading that fast and ideas spreading that fast. So really, when you get ideas popping up in the 3rd century and in the late 2nd century, you should place it further back than we would place ideas, the transmission of ideas today. And so it wouldn't make sense with the historical effect, reasoning back to cause, that it would be a Gnostic document in the 2nd century. And then again, you have the type of people that accepted this doctrine. The type of people that accept this doctrine were people that were extremely anti-Gnostic, which doesn't make much sense if they're cherry picking from Gnostic sources. That's not something you do. You wouldn't see Robert Bellarmine picking up heresies from Luther and Calvin and putting them in his thought because he was writing against Luther and Calvin. That's not something that makes any sense. And
I don't think it's necessarily that simplistic. Could derive from a 2nd century source and then eventually seep its way in. It's not like it's, again, that sounds very simplistic. And people might not know the original sources. So it could originally come from a Gnostic source and seep its way into other areas.
I had a 4th point, but I can't remember what it is. So that's basically a pretty robust. Oh wait, never mind.
You got
Saint Jerome's I got it. Saint Jerome's witness, which Dr. White likes to deride Saint Jerome's witness. It doesn't surprise me that he speaks against saints. He speaks against the church.
Okay.
You have Saint Jerome in the
5th century,
late 5th century, early 5th century, late 4th century, early 5th century. You have Saint Jerome talking about these earlier fathers such as Ignatius and Clement, and I believe even Polycarp and Irenaeus.
Wow.
And he says that these fathers were writing on the Perpetual Virginity. Well, Dr. White brings up the fact that we don't have any of those texts where they talk about the Perpetual Virginity. Well, what's the issue with that? In percentage wise, how many texts do we really have from the 1st and 2nd century that were actually written? You think Christians only wrote one volume in the shaft set from the apostolic age,
Right.
like the sub-apostolic age, that is. It doesn't make sense that we wouldn't just.
How do we derive? How does he make this point? And then we also want to talk about the consensus of the church. We only have a small bit, but we're going to make a consensus based off a small bit, and the small bits that remain that contradict Catholic dogma, we're going to ignore.
Say that St. Jerome wasn't lying, because this was a very important debate, and St. Jerome at the time was in Rome, which he had the access to the best patristic library in the world, bar none, in Rome. So why wouldn't we believe that he had these texts that we're not privy to? Lost patristic texts happen all the time,
and that's so
Heck,
unfortunate.
we have lost texts from St. Thomas Aquinas commenting on one of Plato's dialogues. We have lost texts from some of the reformers. It's not it wouldn't make sense to accept Dr. White's theory over my theory. He says that Jerome was reading forgeries. Well, maybe Jerome would read one forgery, maybe Jerome would read two forgeries, but Jerome wouldn't be reading half a dozen or more forgeries in Rome, which had the best patristic library in the world. And there's just all these factors which make his hypothesis about the historical origin of the doctrine. It makes it not make any sense at all. And there's been people who have answered his claim time and time and time again, but he just doesn't have ears to hear at this point. And I get that, because I've been like that for a really long time before my conversion. I'd get thrown just patristic text after patristic text, and I'd read them myself, and I'd be reading council fathers from the 7 councils who are saying things about the papal supremacy, for example, and I would just dismiss them and take some silly interpretation of the historical origins of the papacy. And yeah, that's.
Is this a good time to mention that pretty much any Catholic historian of any salt that I'm aware of in the modern era doesn't believe there was an early papacy?
About all I have with Perpetual Virginity.
Wow, that's epic, though. I mean, were there other things about Mary that you struggled with that you had to work through, or was it like once that domino fell, all of them fell too?
Honestly, Mariology wasn't. I know that's a big thing for a lot of people, Mariology, but it wasn't for me. I never really ever struggled with it. I do even to this day, I do have some qualms about how popular piety is within the Roman Church, and especially within the late medieval period, which was reformed at Trent. But that's about all I could say about that. But even then, that's not anything official. It's just how some people can perceive certain devotional practices in the wrong way among the lay. But that's not that's really just one of those extremely bad arguments. Like, hey, look, some Catholics do some bad things, therefore don't join the church. Like
Right.
that's one of those arguments.
Yeah, and just to kind of expand now a little bit into just Anglicanism itself.
Yeah.
I've known a lot of Catholics. They kind of, I guess, they bring up the example of King Henry VIII and all of his wives and rejection of the Pope, right? And so, like, to me, that seems like low-hanging fruit.
It is because
Yeah.
if you look at the way in which the papacy related to secular power, that wasn't clear cut throughout the Middle Ages. Like, we may think it's clear cut, but even you get Bellarmine's book on the controversy on the papacy gets placed on the list of what is it called, the list of banned books or something like that by the papacy, where you're not allowed to read it because there's heretical propositions in there. Even Bellarmine's book on the papacy got into hot water over this issue of how secular powers relate to spiritual powers. And you get time and time again, especially in the history of the English church, where there's some kings who will declare that they're exempt in certain aspects from the Bishop of Rome. I mean, the famous case is with St. Thomas Becket, where he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the primate of the English Church, and he was murdered by the king because the king didn't like what he was doing and wanted control over the church. So this was still a live question, and theologians, or Catholic theologians who are canonized saints, are on both sides of this issue when it comes to the relationship of the secular powers and the spiritual powers. So, yeah, that's about all I have to say. I don't like that argument.
My reading of at least late Roman Empire after Constantine was that it really seemed like the emperor was the head of the church. So the Anglicans placing the king at the head of the church or queen seemed to be more spot on than, at least based on a historical basis. Not that I would go for either route.
Argument against Anglicanism, that's not the way in which I would go, because it's not historically unheard of. Like a lot of the way in which we view the Reformation, at least the way in which I sense within the Catholic world the Reformation is viewed, is complete novelties. But really, it's a lot more complex than that. There's a lot of late medieval ideas and theories in theology that are being developed and picked up by the reformers, and they're in some sort of continuity. You could argue a continuity between the two in some of the doctrines. I mean, like the doctrine of anti-episcopacy, obviously not that, but other doctrines such as specific theories of the Eucharist, because there was still debate on that amongst Catholic theologians until Trent really laid the hammer down. So pre-Tridentine Catholicism and pre-Tridentine Western Catholicism is a very sticky situation, and we can't be too dismissive in our historical argumentation. For example,
this is a good admission.
We were talking about the other day with the canon, where there was plenty of Catholic theologians, very solid Catholic theologians, who even in the late medieval period, such as Cardinal Cajetan, who were rejecting the Deuterocanonicals as being on the same.
Plenty of Catholics I talk to can't get this through their head because they are, I don't know why,
level as the rest of the canon, in much of the same way that the reformers would talk about the Deuterocanonicals. So there is some sort of continuity historically between the medieval church and the Reformation, but what we have to say is, rather than there's no continuity, we have to say that is a corrupted continuity, like St. John Henry Newman will talk about. I think that's a much more helpful way forward with.
Which means it's an arbitrary decision. If I can read between the lines, it's an arbitrary decision. Oh, our continuity is better, and I'm going to make up some reasons. You need sola scriptura.
Dialogue between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation than just saying you're completely novel and you were just making all this stuff out of thin air, because that's historically demonstrably false. That's the truth.
Yeah, and just expanding into another issue that people bring up with Anglican, a kind of a hot topic between Anglicans and Catholics is when we declared their holy orders invalid, right?
Yeah,
and that's a hot subject. So what are your thoughts on that?
So have you seen the videos of John Fisher 2.0 and I?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so on my YouTube page, Militant Thomist, in case any of you were wondering, John Fisher 2.0 and I, right before my conversion, this was like, I think I recorded one of the videos the day before I converted. We've been having a little bit of a back and forth about the validity of Anglican orders, and as a Catholic, a good faith Catholic, I have to assent to Apostolic Curie and the arguments made there, and I can't accept the arguments made of Sapius Officio, which was the response of the Anglican archbishops. But there's a big but here. It gets complicated in what's called the modern context. The USCCB talks about it in their report, because do you know what the Old Catholic Church is?
Yeah, I know about them.
Yeah, the Vatican I schism. There was plenty of bishops in the Union of Utrecht who became friendly with a lot of the Tractarians over in England and the Episcopal Church in America, and there was a friendship that was formed, and they went into a sort of organic communion with one another, which involved their bishops, Old Catholic bishops, or in the United States, Polish National Catholic Church bishops, being involved in the consecration of Anglican bishops. So you have, according to the Code of Canon Law, you have people with valid orders, bishops with valid orders, who are also laying hands on these candidates. So in the view of Apostolica Curiae, these people are laymen who are having hands laid on them by valid bishops. And there's an issue of what's called per saltum ordinations, where you have where you have the question of whether somebody can skip over orders, whether, like, if you have a person who was a layman who gets invalidly ordained to the diaconate and invalidly ordained to the priesthood, is he a valid priest? And the Holy Office actually ruled on this in the 19th century to say, yes, he is a valid priest. So expanding that idea and looking at certain patristic.
I know I'm not Anglican, but I'm Presbyterian, but the whole, hey, you got a baton passed to you paradigm. Okay.
Examples of laymen who were, or deacons who were consecrated to the episcopacy without being ordained to the priesthood, I can argue validly from a Catholic point of view, in good faith, accepting the authority of the magisterium, that Anglican orders, at least in the Episcopal Church in America, will be descendants from the Episcopal Church, and continuing, I can argue that they have valid orders without having to go against the magisterium because of Old Catholic orders.
Yeah, you kind of broke out there a little bit at the end, but what you argued was that the American Anglican churches still have valid orders, and you can affirm this without violating magisterial teaching. Is that what you said?
Yes, because of Old Catholic bishops who were involved in the consecration of dozens of American bishops in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, like, is this argument recognized at all in the church, or is this kind of like your deduction, or do you have like more supporters on your side?
I've seen.
I don't think Pope Francis even cares.
It argued before in a USCCB document.
Mm-hmm.
I should bring that up one time with John Fisher 2.0.
Mm-hmm.
Throw that at him, but I haven't seen any.
Oh, let's get them back up. I hit the wrong button. Bear with me, folks. Here we go. Oh, no. All right. Hopefully I didn't miss stuff. Here, let me share. If anybody remembers the timestamp, let me know. I might have skipped ahead or be a little behind.
And validly ordained to the priesthood, is he a valid priest? And the Holy Office actually ruled on this in the 19th century to say, yes, he is a valid priest. So expanding that idea and looking at certain patristic examples of laymen who were, or deacons who were consecrated to the episcopacy without being ordained to the priesthood, I can argue validly from a Catholic point
Probably
of view,
both.
in good faith, accepting the authority of the magisterium, that Anglican orders, at least in the Episcopal Church in America, will be descendants from the Episcopal Church and continuing the magisterium because of Old Catholic.
What you argued was that the American Anglican churches still have valid orders, and you can affirm this without violating magisterial teaching. Is that what you said?
Yes, because of old Catholic bishops who were involved in the consecration of dozens of American bishops in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, like, is this argument recognized at all in the church, or is this kind of like your deduction, or do you have like more supporters on your side?
I've
let's
seen
skip.
it. I'm with more official than that. Bringing it up, I've seen individuals argue for it on the side of Anglicanism, trying to argue in argumentum against Roman Catholic debaters.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that before, but it hasn't been anything which has been discussed on a universal scale. Although there's rumors that that John the 23rd considered this, but never said anything openly about it.
Right.
With the with a certain American Anglican bishop, but that's just all hearsay.
Let me ask you maybe one last question, or maybe two last questions, and then I think that's all I have for this evening. But I'm interested in whether or not the kind of liberalism that the Anglican Church is known for at this point, if that affected you
Pope Francis and Father Martin aren't known for that at all.
Especially because I know that, they're, especially in England, the Church of England over there, they're also having bishops leave and enter the Catholic Church. So what are your thoughts on all that?
It really saddens me, because I mean, like, still going into the ordinariate, like, I still in a certain sense identify as somebody of the tradition of the English Church, and the child of a healed schism. So to see my brothers still on the other side of the Tiber, suffering under that, is really, really difficult. But I was in the ACNA, the Anglican Church in North America, who had a schism with the Episcopal Church back in 2007, and formed a new province of the Anglican Church in North
rightfully
America.
So.
And we became the conservative option for Anglicanism. But as time went on, it became pretty apparent that we were about a decade or two behind the Episcopal Church, because the issue of women's ordination never got solved. Still to this day, women are ordained in the diocese that I currently reside in. There was big debates about that, but a lot of the bishops have taken strong arm stances to retain the practice of the Episcopal Church in ordaining women to priesthood. Although the College of Bishops did restrict women to the episcopacy. So that went on, and then also
that is a good point. Maybe they split off too late.
There has been plenty of homosexual controversies within the ACNA, with bishops and priests. Well, not bishops. I think it was a single bishop, and priests who released a letter affirming gay identity.
It's coming for Rome, coming for all of us. So I'm not throwing stones here.
As something which is good, and other things like that. Some issues with a few priests, and affirming the goodness of abortion, and things like that. It became evident that although we had went one more schism from the schism that we started with, against, apart from the Roman Church, that we were going to have to eventually do another schism, and then another schism, and then another schism. And that's just the way of the Protestants. Sad as that is the history of Protestant ecclesiology and ecclesiastical history has been that the liberals either take over or become influential, and then the conservatives get into their little side of the aisle and then split off from the rest, and then that denomination becomes corrupted, and then that splits again, and it's just.
You could flip this around and be like, that's because Satan's actually attacking us.
Conservatives won't stay and fight, and I know that's a big interest of yours, because it's the same way in politics. Is conservatives like to huddle in their little corner and then split off, and but that's what happens when you have a movement started with a puritanical attitude of ecclesiology. Like you look in the early church with the Donatists, is the Donatists broke off from the church to retain purity. The Montanists broke off from the church to retain purity. They weren't heretical by any means, but the reason a lot of people are splitting away from the church in the same way with the Sedevacantists is purity, purity, purity.
Sedevacantists have a really good point.
And it's just an overrealized, called an overrealized eschatology.
Now I'm going to finish that phrase, but if you actually look at it honestly, and this is why I have sympathy for the Sedevacantists, even though they can't put everything together, is that if you were a Catholic 100 years ago and you came to today, you'd be shocked and horrified.
Is that we're expecting a certain degree of purity in which a divine institution run by humans is never going to have. And
they want their cake and eat it too. So they have, is it organizational unity uber alles?
And we're expecting something which was not promised. Christ never promised that the church would be completely pure. And
but organizational unity is in a separate category.
And all of her limbs, is there's some limbs that are sometimes diseased and sometimes are broken and need to be healed, and limbs that are damaged in many ways. But the way of going about that is healing and bringing back into unity and greater health of the body. It isn't to start chopping your own body up.
Right. That's a good analogy. Christian, so where
this is a again, it's organizational unity is the only virtue. Like, okay, you have all sorts of theology going in, but at least you're not in technical schism. Big whoop.
can we find more of your work, and what happens next?
All right. I don't care. Link to the is already in the description. Link to this video. The whole, well, I'm familiar with James White's arguments already. Well, that doesn't make him wrong. I didn't really hear much about justification. Maybe while I was hearing some stuff in the background that would have here, let's my boy Canadian Catholic. Yeah, that's no. We preach the same gospel. Is there major differences? Yeah, in terms of particulars, but he preached justification by faith alone, and we preach justification by faith alone. So, but people like James White and stuff like that do not. We don't hide the fact that they would have burned, or drowned people with disagreements back then. That's fine. Like the Pope, the current Pope wouldn't do the same discipline as previous, and they don't really view things the same. So that's not. Getting back to the video. To me, besides the lack of anything on justification and the kind of silly authority claims that we went over earlier, not silly, but the inconsistent standards. the thing that kind of struck me was that he wants this arbitrariness on the fathers with the extant writings, and he kind of, it seems like if he just accepted sola scriptura, a lot of his paradigm things that bothered him would have gone away. And maybe he technically accepted sola scriptura, but it didn't seem so based on his what his paradigm was. I don't know. No mention of Pope Francis when you're converting in 2020. That just seems weird. Just seems weird. Anyway, that's what it is. I'm gonna wrap it up for the night. Everybody get adjusted to daylight savings. We went over this in our debate. We can tell people to look it up there. All right, everybody. God bless. Bye.